It is April 15th, 2011, Washington, D.C. Somewhere inside the Eastern District of New York, a federal prosecutor is reading through a 75-page indictment one last time before signing off. The document has taken years to build. It names 11 men. It describes crimes committed not in back alleys or smoky card rooms, but through fiber optic cables, server farms, and a series of offshore shell companies so tangled they took a team of forensic accountants nearly 2 years to unravel. 3,000 miles away in Las Vegas, a man named Ray Bitar is sitting in an office in a building that looks, from the outside, exactly like a technology company. Because that is what Full Tilt Poker is supposed to be. A technology company, a software platform, a tool for enthusiasts. That is the story he has told regulators, banks, and his own employees for years. But the indictment tells a different story. It says that on the morning of April 15, 2011, approximately 2.5 million poker players around the world logged into their Full Tilt accounts and discovered they could not withdraw their money. Their balances were still displayed on screen. The numbers were all there. Some accounts showed $400, some showed $40,000. One account, belonging to a professional player in Sweden, showed more than $1.2 million. None of that money existed. This is the story of Full Tilt Poker, the online poker site that became one of the most trusted names in card gaming, recruited the biggest names in the sport to front its brand, processed billions of dollars in player deposits, and then, quietly, systematically, spent those deposits on itself. By the time the government knocked on the door, the company owed its players $440 million it did not have. The people who ran it had known for years, and they had kept taking the money anyway. It began long before the internet made poker a household game. It began in the rooms where poker was played the old way, face-to-face in smoke and silence for real money. Howard Lederer grew up in New Hampshire, the son of a school teacher. He was bookish, quiet, methodical, the kind of kid who found comfort in logic and rules. He moved to New York City in the early 1980s, barely out of his teens, with the intention of becoming a chess master. He had talent for chess, but he discovered something better. In the clubs and card rooms of downtown Manhattan, young Howard Lederer found poker. Not the social, jovial kind of poker played around kitchen tables. The real kind. The kind where money moves, where psychological edges matter, and where the smartest person in the room consistently wins. He was, by most accounts, the smartest person in most rooms. By the early 1990s, Lederer had relocated to Las Vegas and established himself as one of the most formidable tournament players in the country. He had a reputation for patience, for reading opponents with almost clinical detachment, and for never going on tilt, the poker term for losing emotional control after a bad beat. His peers called him the Professor. The nickname was not ironic. He genuinely approached the game like an academic discipline. He took notes. He reviewed hands. He theorized about probability in ways that most players, operating on instinct and aggression, never bothered to consider. Around the same time, Lederer's younger sister, Annie Duke, was building her own reputation at the tables. And through the tight-knit world of high-stakes poker, he befriended another player who would become central to everything that followed, Chris Ferguson, a man with a doctorate in computer science from UCLA, a cascade of dark hair that fell to his shoulders, and a face so serene and unreadable that opponents had taken to calling him Jesus, not for any religious devotion, for the hair, for the stillness. Ferguson and Lederer were, in many ways, the intellectual core of a new generation of poker professionals. Men who understood that poker was not gambling in the traditional sense. It was a game of skill, played under conditions of incomplete information. And if you were skilled enough, you could extract a consistent, positive expected value over time. They were not gamblers. They were mathematicians operating in a casino environment. Then the internet happened. The first serious online poker site, Planet Poker, launched in 1998. It was rudimentary. The graphics were basic, the software crashed constantly, and real money transactions over the internet felt, to most people at the time, like an act of faith, bordering on insanity. But the game worked. You could log in from your living room and play Texas Hold'em against real opponents for real money. The concept was so simple, and so powerful that it seemed inevitable it would become enormous. It became enormous faster than anyone had predicted. By 2003, something happened that changed everything. A 27-year-old accountant from Tennessee named Chris Moneymaker, yes, that was his real name, turned an $86 online poker tournament entry into a seat at the World Series of Poker main event. He had never played in a live professional tournament. He had no sponsor. He had no profile in the poker world. And he won. He sat down at the final table of the most prestigious poker tournament on earth, faced down seasoned professionals, and walked away with $2.5 million. The television coverage was massive. The story was irresistible. An ordinary man, an amateur, had beaten the best players in the world because he had practiced online. The message was impossible to ignore. Anyone could do this. You just needed a computer, a small deposit, and enough skill. In the 12 months after Chris Moneymaker's win, online poker exploded. PokerStars, which had hosted Moneymaker's qualifying tournament, saw its player base grow by a factor of 10. Smaller sites scrambled to capture market share. Venture capital began circling the space. And in the background, in the card rooms of Las Vegas, where the professionals gathered to dissect the industry's transformation, Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson and a group of their peers were beginning to ask a question that felt, at the time, like the most logical question in the world. Why are we playing on other people's sites when we could build our own? Full Tilt Poker launched in 2004. The premise was straightforward and brilliantly conceived. Instead of simply operating an online poker platform, Full Tilt would recruit the biggest names in professional poker and make them actual stakeholders in the company. Lederer and Ferguson were founders. Phil Ivey, widely regarded as the best active poker player in the world at the time, joined as an owner. So did Patrick Antonius. So did Andy Block. So did Jennifer Harmon. Names that were known, respected, and trusted by the poker community worldwide. For players logging into a new site, the roster was a form of reassurance. These were not anonymous operators running a shadowy offshore platform. These were professionals who staked their reputations on every hand they played. Why would they associate with a site that was not legitimate? The site's software was excellent, the interface was clean and intuitive, the games ran around the clock, and the rakeback, the percentage of each pot that the site took as its fee, was competitive. Full Tilt Poker was, by any measurable standard, a well-run product. Players signed up in enormous numbers. Deposits flowed in. The rake accumulated. By 2006, Full Tilt was processing hundreds of millions of dollars in player transactions every year. By 2008, it had become one of the two largest online poker sites in the world. At its peak on any given night, hundreds of thousands of players from 200 countries were logged in simultaneously, moving money across virtual felt. The rake on that scale was staggering. Here's how the mathematics worked. On a typical cash game hand, Full Tilt would collect roughly 5% of the pot, up to a maximum of $3 per hand. That sounds modest, but when a single table plays 60 hands per hour, and the site is running 200,000 simultaneous tables, the numbers become extraordinary. By the mid-2000s, Full Tilt was generating tens of millions of dollars per month in rake revenue. By 2009, industry analysts estimated the site's annual gross revenue had exceeded $400 million. $400 million. From a platform that had existed for 5 years. The professional players who were listed as owners had their images on the site's homepage. They starred in promotional videos. They played in televised tournaments wearing Full Tilt patches. Phil Ivey's face was everywhere. Lederer gave strategy advice in online tutorials. Ferguson appeared at live events wearing the logo. They were the brand, and the brand was growing faster than anyone in the company could fully comprehend. But there was something happening inside the company's finances that the players depositing their money had no way of seeing. Online poker sites operate on a simple model that requires one non-negotiable principle. Player deposits are held in trust. When a player deposits $200 to play, those $200 belong to the player. The site is essentially a bank. It holds the funds and facilitates the games. The site's actual revenue is the rake, the fee collected from each hand. The deposits are never the site's money. They are always the player's money, sitting in trust, available to be withdrawn at any time. Full Tilt Poker understood this principle. Ray Batar, the CEO who had been brought in to run operations, understood it. The ownership group understood it, and they chose to ignore it. The exact moment when the line was crossed has never been publicly identified. It was not a single decision. It was a series of smaller ones, each of which built on the one before it. At some point in the mid-2000s, Full Tilt began using player deposits to fund company operations. Not to steal, at first, simply to smooth out cash flow. Deposits came in faster than withdrawal requests went out. The money was always there. Why leave it sitting idle when the business had expenses to cover? Then the expenses grew. The professional players who were listed as owners were not receiving a conventional equity stake. They were receiving distributions, cash payments, drawn directly from the company's accounts. By 2007, those distributions had become substantial. By 2009, they had become extraordinary. Howard Lederer received distributions from Full Tilt totaling, according to the eventual government complaint, approximately $42 million. Chris Ferguson received approximately $25 million. Ray Batar, as CEO, received approximately $41 million. Phil Ivey, who later said he had no knowledge of what was happening to player funds, received approximately $30 million over the life of the company. The total amount distributed to insiders over the company's operating life exceeded $400 million. And the player funds that were supposed to be sitting in reserve, set aside, protected, sacrosanct, had been spent, not on legitimate business expenses, on the personal enrichment of the people running the company. Meanwhile, the players kept depositing. There was a poker player in Dublin who had spent 3 years building his Full Tilt account. He had started with 200 euros, ground his way up through low-stakes games, moved to mid-stakes, studied the game obsessively on forums and through hand histories, and by 2010 had an account balance of just over $60,000. He was not a professional. He was a software developer who played poker 2 nights a week and on weekend mornings. He planned to use the money, eventually, as a down payment on a flat. He did not know that $60,000 did not exist anywhere in the physical world. In London, a retired schoolteacher had deposited the equivalent of £15,000 over several years. She played low-stakes Omaha games in the evenings. She found the games meditative. She had no intention of becoming a professional. She simply enjoyed the mental exercise. Her balance on Full Tilt was just under $9,000 the morning she tried to withdraw it, to pay for a medical procedure. The withdrawal did not process. There were more than 2 million players in situations like hers. Some accounts held $20. Some held $200,000. The average balance when the site eventually collapsed was somewhere around $170. Multiplied across 2.5 million accounts. $440 million. Gone. But in 2010, none of this was yet public. The site was still running. Players were still depositing. The processing issues that had begun appearing, withdrawal delays stretching from days to weeks, customer service responses that were vague and evasive, were attributed by the company to banking complications caused by the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act. The UIGEA had been passed by the United States Congress in 2006, slipped into a port security bill at the last moment on a Friday night before a congressional recess. The law did not make online poker illegal for players, but it made it illegal for banks to process transactions related to online gambling. This created a genuine logistical problem for every online poker site. American players still wanted to play, but their banks were now legally prohibited from sending money directly to gaming platforms. Sites had to find workarounds. Third-party processors disguised transaction descriptions, offshore accounts. Full Tilt found its workarounds, but the UIGEA also gave the company a convenient excuse. When players complained about withdrawal delays, the customer service teams pointed to banking complications. The regulators in Alderney, where the site was licensed, were told the same thing. Compliance issues, regulatory friction, third-party processor difficulties. It was true that there were banking complications. It was true that the UIGEA had made international transactions more difficult. But the banking complications were not the reason players could not withdraw their money. The reason players could not withdraw their money was that the money was not there. By 2010, The gap between what Full Tilt held in player funds and what it owed its players had grown to an unmanageable size. The company was not technically insolvent in the traditional sense. It was still generating enormous rake revenue, but the player liability on the books exceeded the actual cash in the accounts by a margin that could not be explained away by banking friction. Multiple people inside the company knew. Ray Bitar knew. The ownership group had been informed. According to later government filings, several meetings were held in which the financial reality of the situation was discussed directly. No public disclosure was made. The site kept running. Players kept depositing. Then, on the morning of April 15, 2011, a date that the poker world would come to call Black Friday, the Department of Justice moved. The indictment unsealed that morning charged 11 individuals with bank fraud, money laundering, and violations of the UIGEA. Among the defendants were the founders of Full Tilt Poker, PokerStars, and Absolute Poker. The DOJ simultaneously seized the domains of all three sites. Players attempting to navigate to PokerStars.com, FullTiltPoker.com, and AbsolutePoker.com found themselves redirected to a government seizure notice. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's seal on a bright white background, a statement that the domain had been seized by the United States government. For PokerStars, the story would move relatively quickly toward resolution. The company had maintained proper player fund segregation. Its players were protected. Within months, PokerStars had reached an agreement with the DOJ, paid a $300 million settlement, and was on its way to returning player funds. For Full Tilt, there was nothing to return. The DOJ's separate action against Full Tilt Poker, filed in September of 2011, described the company in terms that were shocking, even given the context of what had already been disclosed. The government did not describe Full Tilt as a poker company that had mismanaged its finances. The government described it as a Ponzi scheme, a fraud, a mechanism for transferring player deposits into the personal accounts of its operators. The complaint stated that Full Tilt's owners had distributed to themselves at least $440 million in funds that belonged to players, and that at the time the site was shut down, Full Tilt owed its players $440 million it did not have. The numbers were essentially identical. The players had been funding the lifestyles of the people whose faces appeared on the site's homepage. Ray Bitar was arrested. He surrendered himself to federal authorities and was held on bail. He was in genuinely poor health. He had been awaiting a heart transplant, and the stress of the legal proceedings was, by all accounts, severe. His attorney argued for leniency on medical grounds. Eventually, Bitar would plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors. Chris Ferguson disappeared. Not physically, he was not a fugitive, but he went silent. No public statements, no media appearances, no responses to the thousands of players and journalists attempting to reach him. His face, previously everywhere in poker media, vanished. Players who had trusted the site partly because of his endorsement posted on forums in language that mixed grief with fury. He had a doctorate. He had been a respected figure in the game, and he had said nothing. Howard Lederer eventually broke his silence in 2012 with a lengthy interview that he would later describe, with considerable understatement, as a mistake. He explained the banking complications. He pointed to regulatory issues. He expressed sympathy for affected players. He positioned himself as someone who had been misled about the financial situation. The reaction from the poker community was immediate and devastating. The forums lit up. Threads accumulated thousands of posts. The phrase, "the professor of poker," was used, repeatedly, in the most cutting possible context. He had taught the community about the game, and then he had taken their money. Phil Ivey, who had received $30 million in distributions, maintained that he had been unaware of what was happening to player funds. He pursued his own legal action against Full Tilt in an effort to recover his distributions, arguing that he had been a victim like everyone else. His case was settled on undisclosed terms. The poker community's view of Ivey's conduct remained contested for years afterward. The resolution for players came from an unexpected source. PokerStars, now under new ownership following the DOJ settlement, stepped into the vacuum. In 2012, PokerStars reached an agreement with the DOJ and the Rational Group to acquire Full Tilt Poker's assets and intellectual property. As part of the deal, PokerStars agreed to pay $731 million, of which a substantial portion would go directly to compensating the 2.5 million players who had been left holding accounts they could not access. It took time. The claims process was slow and, for many players, frustrating. International players faced additional complications related to jurisdiction. But by 2014, the vast majority of Full Tilt's player balances had been repaid. The Dublin software developer eventually received his $60,000. The school teacher in London received her $9,000. Millions of smaller accounts were restored. The money came back, but not from the people who had taken it. Howard Lederer settled civil charges with the DOJ in 2012, agreeing to forfeit approximately $2.5 million, a fraction of what he had received. He has largely withdrawn from public life. His name, once synonymous with serious poker scholarship, now appears in a different kind of conversation. Chris Ferguson settled civil charges in 2017, forfeiting $1.2 million. He eventually returned to the poker circuit, playing in tournaments with a quietness that some players read as contrition and others read as audacity. At the World Series of Poker 2017, he walked the floor of the Rio Convention Center, while players who had lost money through Full Tilt walked the same floor. Some of them recognized him, some of them said things to him. Ray Bitar, whose health continued to decline, received a sentence of time served. He died in 2014, a year after his heart transplant. He was 45 years old. The Alderney Gambling Control Commission, which had licensed Full Tilt Poker, had its own regulatory failures exposed by the collapse. The site had submitted audited financial statements showing player fund segregation that did not, in fact, exist. How those statements passed regulatory scrutiny remains a question without a fully satisfying answer. What remains is a story about the gap between image and reality. Full Tilt Poker looked like the most credible site in the world. It had the best players, the cleanest software, the most recognizable faces in the sport. Its marketing was built entirely on trust, on the implicit promise that when professionals stake their names on a platform, the platform can be trusted. That promise, it turned out, was the most expensive poker bluff in history. 2.5 million players it called. The cards came up empty. The online poker world rebuilt itself after Black Friday, slowly and differently. Regulation tightened. Player fund protections became a standard requirement in serious licensing jurisdictions. PokerStars, which had operated cleanly and survived the crisis intact, became the dominant force in the industry. The smaller sites that had operated in legal gray areas either shut down or restructured. Online poker never recovered to its pre-Black Friday peak in the United States. The cultural moment, the moneymaker era, the televised explosion, the sense that anyone could sit down online and grind their way to a new life had passed. The players who remained were more sophisticated, more skeptical, and more careful about where they put their money. They had learned something that no strategy article or forum thread had ever told them. The house always wins, even when the house is a man in a cowboy hat with a PhD and a professor's nickname, even when the house is your hero. The money came back for most of the players, that much is true. But the $440 million that sat in player accounts while the site ran, money that was supposed to be protected, supposed to be untouched, supposed to be as safe as money in a bank, that money bought houses and cars and private jet flights for the people running the scam. It bought a lifestyle that the average Full Tilt player, grinding through low-stakes games in a Dublin apartment or a London suburb, could not have imagined. And for the months between April 2011 and the eventual settlement, for the players who could see their balances on screen but could not touch them, for the retired teacher who needed that $9,000 for a medical procedure, for the software developer who had been so careful, so patient, so methodical. Those months were not a legal dispute. They were a particular kind of loss. The loss that comes from discovering that the people you trusted with your money looked at that trust and saw an opportunity. The final irony belongs to the game itself. Poker is a game about reading people, about detecting the deception behind the composed face, about knowing when someone is representing a hand they do not actually hold. The players who loved Full Tilt Poker had been playing that game for years. And the whole time, the people running the site had been sitting across the table, looking them in the eye and bluffing.